if you had a particular take on, in terms of procurement, which is a real bugbear, which is all wrapped up with funding applications. Have you, in your experience, seen advantages for framework agreements over traditional tendering processes for housing providers?
Yeah, that's a good question. I haven't procured contractors for a couple of years because I've been at Turner and Townsend, so I've been slightly away from that. And I do believe there's been a slight growth in the market, but people could tell me otherwise. I have used both routes previously. I think there are pros and cons to both. It also depends on your understanding of procurement and any support you may have and legal support within your organisations. And I would say if that's quite limited, and also your experience of writing tenders is also a little bit limited or within the retrofit sphere, I would focus on a framework because they will have done all of that for you. So you can run a mini tender. So you will have to provide obviously some information on the project that you want to run, type, number of houses, the types of installations that you want to do, and that sort of period. And any specific kind of materials you might want to use. You might want to specify particular EWI, for example. So they can be really helpful. I have run successful mini tenders through a framework, and I have also run a not so successful mini tender through a framework. So I think it is a bit of a mixed bag, and it will depend on the demand in the market at the time that you are applying. I think there's a lot of people probably on the call that are already have contracts. Now they may have procured purely just for SHDF Wave 2.1 or perhaps Wave 2.2. So you might be limited in the scope of that. You may be able to agree an extension. And I think through public procurement rules, you're allowed to go up to 50% over the contract value. But I'm not a procurement specialist, so I don't want that to be taken as being gospel. I would recommend getting some advice from a procurement professional before you take that approach. But that can help you sort of transition between one program and the other. Obviously, it is unlikely to help you all the way through that program, but it may enable you to think about starting another procurement process for the second half or a third of the way through. So you might be able to run your existing procurement through the first year and also run a procurement process so you've got new contractors in place for year 2 and 3. So does that answer that question, Andy?
Yeah, very much. That's a very interesting final point you're making about having that rolling procurement sense to the issue. Don't see it as a project by project thing that you're doing. Really, it's a much longer term thing, isn't it? Working it out.
I mean, obviously, depending on the scale of retrofit you need to do and having that capital expenditure program in place to be able to continue that perhaps outside of a grant funding window. But yes, it can be helpful.
Yeah. Right, thanks very much. I've got one for Rory. Rory, with the introduction of more flexible multi-tenure schemes in Wave 3, how will housing associations ensure that the required 30% social housing participation is met? And what challenges might arise in balancing the different tenure types?
It's a good question. I'm not sure I've got a fantastic answer to it, if I'm honest. I mean, I think that the more opportunities to retrofit should be brought into scope by the changes in the multi-tenure requirements. So less social homes needed in a block for that block to become eligible. So I think that's positive, and it will mean that social landlords can address more stock with access to grant funding. I think also the other critical change is that leaseholders in any scheme are not being asked to contribute towards the retrofit under Wave 3, and I think that will have an impact again on take up. But obviously, I mean, I can't advise on housing associations' approach to individual schemes, but I think generally, from our conversation with members, it's been welcomed in terms of the additional flexibility, and it should mean that more schemes are able to be delivered, and we're not kind of restricted by pepper potting throughout multi-tenure schemes.
Yeah, right. There's quite a lot of rule changing generally coming, isn't there, up the road? There's PAS 2023 on the horizon. There's also, I think, after 3 waves or 3 iterations of carrying out the work now, there's also an overwhelming concern about resident engagement and dropout off the back of what we were just mentioning there. I've got a load of questions about that, which I'm just going to put. Well, there's a couple to LivGreen specifically, but generally, what specific strategies? This one's addressed to Agnese. But I'm afraid a lot of these are anonymous. I have to say, I can't credit anybody. I just read them out. But there's one for Agnese specifically, but I would open it to the whole panel. What specific strategies have been most effective in engaging tenants, particularly in overcoming myths and promoting the benefits of retrofit? And how would you measure the success of these engagement efforts?
You want me to kick off with that one? I think, as I touched on in the presentation, the best approach has been where the housing provider has written to the tenants involved in the scheme with a letter from them and a leaflet potentially enclosed as well, explaining the type of work that's been proposed, what impact it will have, what disruption tenants would suffer, what order it's going to be done in. They can then include a link to their website and more detailed information, including copies of plans and architect impressions can be uploaded onto that website. So that's worked really well. And that should quickly be followed by face-to-face engagement if possible. It could be a community event at a local building, or it could be door knocking on the street, just going door to door with hopefully a recognised tenant engagement officer who's been working in that area for a while, and they can answer any questions, allay any fears. Following that, we would recommend introducing the contractor and who they are and how they are going to be working in the area. And the contractors can follow with a similar approach by holding a meeting or again going door to door to introduce themselves. And some of the things that will work particularly well with contractors is offering additional help to the tenants. For example, we've had skip days where they provided free skips in the area for tenants to empty their lofts of junk that might have been built up for over many decades and needs clearing out before some of the retrofit measures can be done. But that builds trust and a bit of a goodwill as well with the tenants, and has worked really well in engaging them for the more intrusive works that you might be proposing.
Yeah, I've seen that other housing associations have used also lots of sort of rewards and incentives. I just wondered if you had any program for doing that. Sometimes if you're doing really intrusive stuff, you could maybe have membership to clubs or gyms or stuff where you're able to coordinate being out of the home while people come in, or even completely decamping to other accommodation. I think that works better with flats. Have you got that far, that sophisticated with your tenant incentivization?
It's not something that I'm aware of that any of the housing providers have used. It may come as we start delivering in the high-rise flats, as you suggest. But up until now, it's been more practical assistance that's been provided to them, and it's been gratefully received. And that's, they've become on first name terms with a lot of the tenant engagement officers, and they'll see them walking down the streets and have a chat and discuss any problems or issues they're facing. And when they see that they're getting listened to and the problems are getting resolved, then that helps to build that trust and partnership approach.
Absolutely. I'd also, I mean, I could say something on this too from our point of view, but the same question is being directed through the questions to my colleague Rolf. I don't know if you'd like to sort of follow on from what you were saying before and talk about the other end, or the engagement with residents that you've done talking with clients during their grant funding award applications.
Yeah, it's good. Thanks, Andy. Yeah, just to build on what Agnese has said, lots of really good points. And I think we have to understand our tenants, we have to understand the demographic that we're working with, because certain things will work better for different demographics. I think we've seen some where you've got a younger demographic. We've seen even Zoom meetings work quite well, where you've got a question and answer panel, if you like, that anyone can join on, and you've got your resident liaison officer, you have your contractor on board, you even have your coordinator maybe to answer the technical questions, but that helps give people confidence. I think we've seen a lot of, one of the key things we've seen the need of is the reduction of anxiety. We often talk about anxiety, and that comes really through fear of the unknown. So the more we can reduce the unknowns, I think the easier it is for the tenants to understand. I think also being honest about it and not overselling the works. The facts are that it is disruptive, it is noisy, it is inconvenient, but I think the overarching impression and message we get for those that have had the work done is that whilst it has been an interruption, it's been worth it. And I've had 6 weeks of work going on, but now I've got 5-10 years of reduced energy bills. I've got a warmer, cozier home. I haven't got the drafts, and I think I agree. It came in earlier. The best people to give this message are often people that have had the works done already, and I think they will engage the type of language that resonates with others. I think we've come across that where we've been potentially a bit too technical, using terms that might not make sense to some residents. And I think putting ourselves in their shoes and trying to look at it from their perspective is one of the most powerful things. But I think what Annie said about being clear about the different measures, what's expected, and sharing some wins and the long-term benefits is really the critical thing to do. Is that right, Andy?
No, that's great. Sorry, I'm getting some ideas as we're going through this. I've also got I'm going to ask another. I'm just going to try and spread the love around. Another question, sort of tagging on from something I mentioned earlier on to Riser Kate, which is what kind of technical assistance does RISE provide to ensure compliance with the new standards of SHDF Wave 3, such as the transition to PAS 2023, which I mentioned? Could you comment on that at all, Kate? Or
I'll do my best, yes. So we do offer a range of support, and it really depends on the needs of the individual applicant. So some people might want more support on procurement. Some people might want more support on resident engagement, both of which we've spoken about. Some people might want more support on data support. But there is a range, including governance and all looking at teams, internal teams. PAS 2035 is key to that. It's key to understand your internal team needs. It's key to understand your programming of your project and the types of properties that you're doing, but it's also really key to your procurement approach. So we can support across the board. As many of you know, we probably have attended perhaps in the past, we do have our masterclasses. We do update those as we get information that comes through. We are working with Trustmark at the moment to try and get some specialist support around the transition from 2019 to 2023, because I do understand there seems to be quite a lot of confusion. I would say at this point, I am not 100% sure what the process is either. So hence trying to get it directly from Trustmark. There are two areas that I'm keen to look into. So I'm hoping that we'll have some masterclasses coming out in the next couple of months, but there's nothing programmed in at the moment. There are two areas. So the transition phase. So I understand that you can use 2019 retrofit assessments through to delivery under the 2019 PAS post the April, end of March cut-off period. I don't know if there is going to be a period when those are acceptable. So if you've done a bunch of retrofit assessments under Wave 2.1 and you haven't delivered them for whatever reason, it may be that you've had to do additional works to get off the ground and you've parked them and you're going to come back to them perhaps for an application for Wave 3, but you've already got a retrofit assessment in place, and it will stand because you're not changing any of the thermal elements. You will be able to use those as you take them forward. but there may be a cutoff point where you can't use those. So what I would say, if you are applying Challenge Fund and you're thinking about doing a phase request and you're thinking about your 3-year program, you might want to do a bunch of homes in a first phase. Let's say it's 50 homes, I don't know, or 20 homes, depending on if you're in a consortium. And you might want to use those 2019 versions of your retrofit assessment and your retrofit coordination. But you might want to look past in April, looking at getting new retrofit assessments under the new process so that you're not wasting money up front. At some point, they might say, no, you can't use that. It's old. You need to be using the current version. But there is a little bit of wiggle room to the best of my knowledge. So that is one of the areas we're looking at. The other side of that is the upload of information onto the Trustmark data warehouse, which I understand is quite a painstaking process. And I would like Trustmark, if we can get them to do it, to sort of go through that as a step-by-step process, and for them to help people understand what they need to do, so that that is a lot easier for applicants who might be doing it, and to work with their suppliers to make sure they're getting all the information that they need and how they need to upload it. So hopefully we can get something in the next 2 months. So fingers crossed on that one.
That's grand. I'd urge you to really take them to task about what the audit requirements will be, because lodgement's one thing, but audit's then a whole raft of additional information. So that's the unpredictable bit. Speaking from experience.
Is this audit from Trustmark, or is this audit from the department?
Audit from Trustmark, yeah.
Okay, that's another one. So I'll have a conversation with that.
If you're working with them, that's great. No, that's really good. I think that's a big one for a lot of our clients, is the overlap, and how valid will getting retrofit assessments done now be over the line, later down the line. So, I mean, the rule of thumb I'm working is once we get there, just make sure that they're to the new standard. You know, the PAS SAP is also, or RD-SAP is also due to be completely upgraded, ideally in line with the changeover to 2023, but there's no date. There's no date announced yet, so everybody's getting ready for it, but nobody knows quite what's happening. I'm sure it's just going to whip up a fervor of communication, so that can't be a bad thing in of itself. Thanks very much for that. That's brilliant. I've got another one for Rory, with absolutely no link to the previous one, which is with the recommendation for a 33.8 billion allocation for low carbon heat transition by 2050. How do you envisage this funding will be distributed, and what role will housing associations play in its implementation?
It's a good question. So, I mean, just to clarify what this is, so the National Infrastructure Commission is a quasi-government body that sits aligned to the Treasury, and it made a recommendation at the end of last year for this money to be brought forward by government, and for government to fully fund the transition to clean heat in social housing up to 2050. Obviously, it's just a recommendation of one body at the moment, and so that funding is not around yet. I think a reflection that I do have on it is that you know, over the next 5 years, there's a really obviously significant focus on upgrading energy efficiency, and you know, the money in the SHDF is obviously primarily directed at that. And partly in the presentation, you know, I gave the kind of reasoning behind why it's directed so much at insulation, but the scale of that figure makes you kind of realize that the ultimate thing that we're aiming for here is transition to clean heat. And I think you're seeing a lot of government bodies, the National Infrastructure Commission, I think you'll see the Climate Change Committee come out with it soon, saying that energy efficiency is obviously essential, but in reality, the carbon reduction that you get from it is minimal, and we're going to need to upscale that very significantly to meet climate targets. So I think it's just about, the reason why I brought it up is because it's something that we need to have a bit more of a think about in the sector. I think about what that longer term clean heat transition looks like, where the funding comes for it, and you know, get on with the target of 2030, but potentially start kind of orienting our thinking a bit more towards how do we get heat pumps and decarbonised heat networks rolled out at scale, and you know, what is the kind of policy and funding changes that we need for that. So it's a bit of a vague answer, but I think it's useful to look at the scale of the funding in comparison to what they're recommending for SHDF, and kind of factor that into plans for the next 20-30 years.
Yeah, I think again the SAP the overhaul of SAP as well, I think, will have something to do with it. I think there's a strong perception at the moment about what should be prioritised, and it's governed by the way EPCs are carried out and SAP is understood, which is kind of related to a bygone era.